ideals and exposing the American reality for American Indians, African Americans, immigrants, and other oppressed people living in the margins of American society. He was known as the poet laureate of the Negro race for writing about the culture of the African Americans, of the jazz and the blues, but his revolutionary voice, stating the historical subjectivity of his race, was deliberately ignored by his editors and publishers during his lifetime. Today, when racism is raising its ugly head in America again, it has become pertinent to remember and discuss the works of this important writer of the Harlem Renaissance, whose rebellious voice is as important in the present whose poetry is pithy, powerful, commanding, and capable of expressing the voices from the margins in spite of hegemonist repressive rhetoric and incessant attempts to manipulate, suppress, or obscure it. His poetry is simple and expresses the African American experiences, diversities of thought, and emotions of his people, and dreams that he saw common to African Americans in particular, and deprived human beings in general. Hughes has written widely about colored cosmopolitanism, describing the pain of the oppressed of the world as a shared reality of his American condition. His desire to express the angst of the blacks finds currency in the definition and explication of feminine writing by Michel Montrelet, for whom, I quote, desire is the prerequisite for symbolization and, she suggests, can only be satisfied in language. A feminine writing, Montrelet stresses, is thus one in which the writer and hence the reader, instead of attempting to recreate the lost objects in words, plays with and enjoys the pleasures of signifying procedure itself. This paper will attempt to analyze the poetry of Langston Hughes in the light of Écriture féminine in order to show how Hughes counters hegemony's repressive rhetoric and challenges the loss of agency through the language of the dominant class and recreates another symbolic form. Hughes' poetry depicts the realities of American life and racially colored language. Most of his poems are about the plight of the African Americans under the repressive forces of racism. But his editors during his lifetime looked at it from their own perspective. For them, I quote, his revolutionary prose and poetry represented an aberration, an isolated phase of his early career. So, unquote. Faithberry comments that contrary to what the editors of Hughes said, his racial writings, I quote, were not a product of his early career. Many had appeared in print by 1940s, but by which time he was the established author of 7 poetry collections, a novel, a juvenile, a volume of short stories, a Broadway play, an autobiography, and the recipient of numerous literary prizes. Some of his most radical works were written during the same period when his popular works appeared. Hughes' revolutionary work pointed to the discrimination and cruelty of the Americans towards African Americans, which was considered at the time to be insignificant, very much like the treatment meted out to most feminists. His critique of hierarchy and social discrepancies and apartheid was overlooked, not only by his editors, but also by his critics who attributed his revolutionary writing to a passing phase in his literary career and concentrated more on other facets of his writing. Even Harold Bloom, in his introduction to Bloom's Modern Critical Views, Langston Hughes, New Edition, published in 2008, and that was much after the death of Hughes, derides his work as insignificant compared to the literature written by the white writers like Whitman and Salinger. He comments that Hugh's poetry is anchored on, I quote, folk tradition ranging from blues to spirituals to jazz songs to work chants to many other modes. But his poems on the whole do not compare adequately to the best instances of those cultural models. Unquote. Bloom was typically dismissive about Hugh's work, which he thinks are mere social and political considerations and not masterpieces of it. He writes, I quote again, social and political considerations, which doubles with which doubtless will achieve some historical continuity, will provide something of an audience for Hugh's poetry. His first autobiography, The Big C, may be his most lasting single book, though its aesthetic values are very mixed. Rereading it, plus his second autobiography, I Wander as I Wander, his selected poems, and the Langston Hughes Reader, so I come to the sad conclusion, I, meaning Harold Bloom, says this, come to the sad conclusion that Hughes' principal work was his life, which is to say his literary career. Undaunted by the criticism from the American academic elites, Hughes continues writing poetry and inscribing the experiences of pain and indignity of the African Americans in his poetry. For him, writing poetry has become a sacred covenant. Arnold Rampersack notes in his introduction to the collected works of Langston Hughes, which was published in 1995, that, I quote, while Hughes wished to write no verse that was beyond the ability of the masses of the people to understand, his poetry, in common with that of the primitive writers, is replete with allusions that must be respected and understood if it is to be properly appreciated. To respect Hughes' work, above all, one must respect the African American people and their culture, as well as the American people in general and their national culture. Rampersack's comment moves us from a monocular view of Hughes' poetry to that which this paper is attempting to project. This paper attempts to locate Hughes' poetic diction as écriture féminine, since, like feminist poetry, the diction of this poetry is rebellious and questions the hierarchical structure of society where white people hold more power and promote the idea of racial superiority. Hughes' poetry crossed the boundary of the ordinary and the stereotypical depiction of Black life located in the white-centric vision of the Americans and married a complex and generally unnoticed aspect of Black life. In his essay, Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, Hughes himself narrates the frustration of the African American artist in face of white oppressors. His poetry reflects the pain, the frustration, and the trauma of having dreams that will never be fulfilled in the dominant white society of the North. Hughes, in his early poetry, wrote about the domestic life of the African American people and explored these themes as well as the pain of the African American life found through music, like the blues and the jazz. And his later poems were increasingly political, tending towards Marxist ideology. He revolts against the white domination of the blacks in America, which accrues patriarchal dimensions. His poetry becomes subversive in I Look at the World. He writes, I look then at the city walls, to dark aisles and dark place, and this is what I know, that all these walls oppression builds will come to go. I look at my own body with eyes no longer blind. I see that my own hands can make the world that's in my mind. And let's hurry. In the center stage of American life, the central to the rise of Hughes, his prophetic lines, all these walls, oppression bills will have to go. Speak of rebellion of a people subjected to endless feminist pain and frustration, repressed and marginalized over centuries. Body becomes an important site of performativity that has been subjugated and now demands agents. Like feminist writing, Hugh's writing was an act of liberation, a means of addressing the crisis of African American existence in racially polarized America. Bereft of agency and pinned to the margins of society, the racially oppressed African Americans sought liberation through their writings, their strategy, much akin to the strategies of the feminist movement. Here, I attempt to adopt the interest of the feminist wave of thought that writing was an act of liberation from the anxieties and depression and apply them to Langston Hughes's writing, which is bound to the psychological ideas of blackness as perceived by both African Americans and the patriarchal white, and thereby widen the scope of écriture féminine. Set against the background of hatred and discrimination, Hugh's work is vastly subversive. It's vastly subversive, expressing the desires and passions of the African Americans, very much in line with the feminist thoughts of Teresa de Langes, who says that, I quote, the notion of the experience in relation both to social material practice and to the formation and processes of the subjectivity in the feminist concept, unquote. Analyzing the works of Hughes in the framework of feminist theory will be appropriate since feminist theory is a specific kind of political discourse, a critical theoretical practice committed to the struggle against patriarchy, racism, and sexism. Berry, in the introduction to an edited volume of Hughes' writing on social protest, states that Hughes was almost always, albeit unwillingly, he has always unwillingly written that his publishers and white audience have wanted him to what his white audience and publishers wanted him to write. Quite often, he has suppressed his private self and integrity in layers of public self since he got the much needed economic stability from his writings. I quote, publishers who were enthusiastic about his jazz and blue poems would not touch poems such as Good Morning Revolution. He could write revolutionary tracts, but he could not make a living from them. A situation that continually posed for him the choice between a livelihood and writing was his livelihood or a sacrifice. Not to compromise his principles, he contributed some of the most incisive works he ever produced to small, obscure magazines and newspapers. Hugh's position was rather like the political position of Richard Wright. Wright projects a willingness to speak as Americans would have him speak, that is, as the stranger. He speaks as the outsider whose challenge to American culture can be absorbed, even if it is to be acted upon rather than deflected because it is a challenge from outside. But Fairberry's volume of Hughes' collected works contains those militant, revolutionary pieces of social protest written by him over 32 years, which he had deliberately backgrounded. Fairberry notes that I quote, social and political ideas Hughes espoused during the 1930s are evident in his poetry as early as 1925. They appear in his later writings, though he was by then reluctant to discuss such ideas publicly, especially on lecture tours. In the 1940s and thereafter, his income was as dependent upon public readings as upon published books. A major reason he did not anthologize works he was hesitant to read before the audience. Late in his career, he attempted to publish a volume which eventually appeared posthumously as the Pamper on the Latch. In her book, Works of Langston Hughes, Vera Kuczynski admits that little has been explored about the multiplicity of the writings of Langston Hughes. She comments, clearly in the, I quote, clearly in the terms of discourses on race, nationality, and sexuality, and class that insist on fixed subject positions, Hugh's multiple lived and imagined truths are neither possible nor intelligent. Discerning these truths and fully grasping their strategic slipperiness requires us to tune our scholarly tools to the ideological and historical frequencies of the languages and discourses in which we constitute our own senses of identity, place, and belonging. Bringing James Baldwin and Richard Wright into context adds significance to the argument that African American writing serves to identify and then condemn the internal dynamics of American culture, proving racism and the constant underlying note that the African American, though once literally a stranger in America and considered by many Americans, including Black Americans themselves, is still to be a stranger of sorts constitutes as foundational element in the construction of that culture as American white. The African American, therefore, must make his fellow American see him not as a stranger, but as an American. Baldwin considered Wright's Bigger Thomas to be much like Stowe's Uncle Tom. I quote, the incarnation of a white racist. He feels Wright's novels omits the relationship that Negroes bear with one another, that depth of involvement and unspoken recognition of shared experience which creates a way of life. In this connection, it is relevant to discuss what Derrida called the femininity of writing. Susan Sellers explains by citing Derrida that Derrida stresses that this conceptual system operates in language only through ignoring and suppressing the way language actually works. He suggested that writing, more than speech, retains the knowledge of its creation, and he employs his knowledge to unravel the complex threads of another description. He argued that writing's own differential structure incorporates meaning beyond those the writer intended, since the process of meaning entails gaps in which other possibilities can erupt beyond the writer's control to contradict and challenge his purpose. This supplement, Derrida suggests, is what gives writing its other status, since writing always contains the unconscious knowledge of its formation, other meanings, and the potential for the reader to interpret the text in another way. It is this function that underlies Derrida's insistence on the femininity of writing, which he argues has the capacity to deconstruct the parameters of our conceptual system. The writings of James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Langston Hughes are examples of the unspoken and coded shared experience of the African Americans in a racialized America. Hughes' poetry retains the knowledge of its creation, emanating from the angst of So Hughes' poetry retains the knowledge of its creation emanating from the angst of African American life and the struggle for dignified existence. Our Land is one such poem which demonstrates the concept of America as the land of plenty and the land of happiness, stating that America is a land where joy is wrong. We should have a land of joy, of love and joy and wine and song, and not this land where joy is wrong. The meaning escapes from the writer's control, and the reader notices the gap in the intent and contradicts the glorified picture of America that vouches inclusivity and happiness. According to Elizabeth Cross, the project of the picture family is concerned for the writing being an inert, passive, non-cultural, historic term, the body may be seen as a crucial word, site of contestation in a series of economic, political, sexual, and intellectual struggles. Hugh's lines from I Look at the World testify to this. He writes, I look at my own body with eyes no longer blind. I see that my own hands can make the world that's in my mind, and let us honeycomb the road. African American bodies has historically been a site of negative signifiers, accepted passively by both the whites and the blacks alone. Langston Hughes' lines, I look at my own body with eyes no longer blind, is the coming of age of African Americans who now have decided to reclaim agency and revolt against oppression. Saunders Redding, in the foreword to Langston Hughes' Good Morning Revolution, writes that the militant revolutionary pieces of writing gave expression to a wanted, though still unattained, American idea, and that the emotive characteristics communicate the wish, the hope, the faith that were Langston Hughes's all along, and that indeed inspired and were the themes of nearly all he wrote. And a sign of a colored line for the freedom train with yours and me. It is pertinent here to note Helen Sisso's observation regarding the construction of woman. She writes, I quote, if you are woman, you will resemble ideal woman. You will obey the imperatives and mark your line. You will channel your desires. You will address them where, how, and to whom it is from. You will honor the laws. I would like to cite Putin's piece observation here. She says that there were substantial pressures on a black autobiographer in the USA to construct himself as a subject that would represent African Americans in just the right ways, as valued citizens and loyal patriots. You face this issue not once, but in two autobiographies, that is, The Big C, published in 1940, and I Wonder as I Wander in 1956. Moving back to feminist writing, we will look at Susan Seller's discussion of the common, where she explains that, I quote, since the boy, unlike the girl, possesses a physical equivalent of the phallus, the girl's relationship with the symbolic order is complicated in a way that the boy's is not. The fact that the girl has no means of representing herself, even her black, she has no penis to embody the phallus that stands both for the lost object, that is the mother, and for the act of signifying this, places her in a problematic relationship or a problematic relation to symbolic code, since, as Lacan suggested, she cannot herself figure within its order and thus only exists according to man's definition of her death. The problematizing of the African American active participation and visibility in the symbolic code of American society gathers meaning and can be comprehended in the paradigm of oppression. The nullified African American can be substituted for the castrated female. In this poem, A Black Pharaoh, Hughes writes, I'm a black pharaoh, and she does not love me. So, with my once gay-colored soul shrunken like a balloon without air, I went forth in the morning to seek a new brown love. The pharaoh is a strong comic character, as you know. I'm not going to elaborate on that. So, Hughes' gray-colored or happy soul is like a shrunken balloon without air. Unacknowledged and marginalized by the American society, which refuses to hear the voice of the African Americans, he turns to Africa to find signification. Similarly, in another poem, he writes, hold fast to dreams, when dreams go, life is a battlefield frozen with snow. Implying that life for African Americans in America is like a battlefield frozen with snow, where their dreams are stuck. This experience is continued in his poem, Negro Ghetto, and Hughes doesn't find any happy person in the ghetto, where what he finds are black faces who are imprisoned. sorry, what he finds there are black faces who are imprisoned in a supposedly free land. He sees people with the wing imprisoned in the flesh and their sun bound down by law. His heart goes out to these humble people who are resilient and keep moving with, moving like water down the street. Look at the image and look at the words used and the language used. Centuries of oppression have made the black people numb, and reality of their existence is negated, ignored, or mocked by the dominant white Americans who express absolute humility from the African Americans. Elsewhere, into certain Negro leaders, Hughes writes, voices crying in the wilderness at so much for word from the white folks. Me, I'm hungry. All you niggers do not cry too. The white people whose points out are applicable to the cause of the African American. They mute the protest of the blacks and impose cultural silence on them. Entire Hughes acknowledges cultural and personal fatigue on a dangerous resilience where the hopeless people who have been waiting for the world to become good and beautiful and kind are willing to, I quote, take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the wind. The marginalized other of the white world are signified by worms who are to beget the waste or the rain thrown to them. The lack of being treated as equal human beings brings about a permanent and profound sense of loss, which garners meaning in Helen Sisulu's argument that the white people assume the inherently masculine status by encoding discrimination as lack in the other. She visualizes agency in encoding lived experience. Through writing, I quote, through writing in ways that will enable us to view ourselves and the world differently. Sizzle stresses the potential of feminine writing to work through loss, which she argues will inevitably challenge the current structure of self-other relations. She urges the feminine writer to reclaim the lived experience which the masculine symbolic seeks to bar. Hughes indeed attempts to reclaim the lived experience of the African Americans by challenging the self-other relations imposed by the whites on the blacks. In Scottsboro, he boldly writes and subverts established cultural performativity. He meets 8 black boys in a southern jail, all in capital letters. World turned big. 8 black boys and 1 white lie. I get goosebumps when I read this poem. 8 black boys and 1 white lie. It is much to die. Is it much to die? And in white man, his defiance is evident. Sure, I know you. You're a white man. I'm a negro. You take all the best jobs and leave us in the garbage cans to empty and the house to eat. Hughes defended the importance of a distinctly black art and criticized this urge within the race towards whiteness, desire to pour the racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to see, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. The meanings of the words in his poetry, stories, and plays change if viewed from the perspective of the African American rather than the racist white American. Nico Slate rightly argues that, I quote, Hughes' refusal to be seen as just an American artist entails not just separation from the American nation, but integration with oppressed peoples throughout the world. Hughes' global integration did not come primarily through his poems about the world, rather, it was his most intimate poems about the Black experience that endowed Hughes with a global audience. It was that audience, ultimately, that rendered language of the colored world. Foreign readers globalized Hughes and drafted him into the cause of colored solidarity. They made its poems speak to their experience. Oppressed people, especially women, created a language of their own as a reaction in a famous essay, I Am Not a Woman Writer, about women, literature, and feminist theory today, which was published in 2008. She says, I quote, championed in France by writers and psychoanalysts like Sitsuma and was a parallel development more intimately bound to psychoanalytical ideas of feminism. Since violence and racism were the reality of African American experience, were and still are the reality of African American experience, Langston Hughes' poetry are in a similar vein radical, expressing his own reaction against the oppressed and the oppression suffered by the African Americans in the language of the beyond his opposition to the white capacity imposed upon the African Americans in every sphere of their existence and expressions of their ongoing inner struggle. Hughes' poetic language remains within the symbolic order and the symbolic order of the oppressor and creates the lived experience of the other. So while that language remains within, or that language is in the symbolic order of the oppressor's language, it creates the lived experience of the other from the one. Thereby, it enacts what Julia Kristeva suggests in the context of feminine language. It goes from within, unsettling and challenging, though never completely destroying the structures of the symbolic here, American language and society of the oppressed, where the oppressor imposes certain codes on the oppressed. Thank you very much for being. Thank you very much, ma'am. For your exploratory paper on Japanese poetry. Langston Hughes poetry with a focus on feminism, especially as a critique on hierarchy, as a commentary on hierarchy, and poetry as a sacred commitment of Hughes, poetry as a poetic fiction. Sorry, always confused of Langston Hughes. Poetry as a rebellious tone in the form of its fiction of Langston Hughes, and poetry you have touched upon as a survey of early poems and later poems of Langston Hughes with social and political ideas that are involved in his poetry. And you focused on the challenges of the self and the other relations, especially on the perspective of African American suppression. And now the paper is open for discussion. I request the online participants to interact with Professor Dusk on a paper which was delivered just now. And the forum is open for discussion now. And I encourage you to, ma'am, this is out of my curiosity. Simone de Beauvoir's second sex, one is not born.
but made our. That statement itself is it's like for generations. Another 50 years can talk on that particular single statement of Simon de Beauvoir's second sex as an important critique of feminisms that paved way as a mid-term understanding between first wave and second wave. How do you contextualize Simone de Beauvoir and her commitment to that of licentious poetry in its feminine context? Right? And
Well, in the second sex, Simone de Beauvoir has said that um, a female is not born but made. Similarly, if you look at the history of early America, you will find that the African American was free till they made the laws. They were landowners, they were free people, and till they made the laws. And when they made, I mean, they included, because, earlier even white people were taken as slaves. And so their history changed with I'm forgetting the year, but sometime in the 17th century, when the state of Virginia made a rule and they were made slaves, they were made to be the other. Because till then, they were participating, they were voting, and they were also settlers. Because all of them were not brought as slaves, but some of them had migrated to America from the European continent. Just like the Portuguese, just like so many other peoples. If you read Toni Morrison's A Mercy, you can see that. So when the laws were made and they were subjugated, they were oppressed, they were made the other. They were made some kind of a secondary citizen or somebody who was insignificant, like the woman who cannot speak. So this we realize as Indians because even in the Manu Sangita, the woman, even like what's happening in Afghanistan today, in the Muslim world today, that when in all these Islam republics, it was very much also happening in India, and it's still there in majority part of the rural spaces in India, where a woman and a tree and a poem or a creation cannot exist without the help of a male or needs a male for realization. Vinashray Lavardhanti Kavita Vanika Lata. So you see, they are always made the other, and similarly, the free African Americans or the free Africans, well, they were dark, so they were called niggers. So when the negre, right, in French it is black. And so they came here because of the skin color and because they could work and because the white wanted the to consolidate whiteness, and they wanted the support of all the European nations in America. That is the reason why they segregated these people, and they saw that African Americans were hardy. They could work a lot. They could, they were different in skin color, and they were intelligent. They knew all they knew, and that's why subjugating them and making animals, okay, would kind of justify their own existence in America. Because America, for everybody, was an unknown space, full of resources, but they did not know how to tap the resources. Whereas African Americans knew how to tap resources. So they were other. So Simone de Beauvoir's statement here is absolutely, in my perspective, in my view, is absolutely applicable to the African Americans. Thank you very much. I hope I have answered the question.
Thank you, ma'am. I request the online participants to interact. First, I welcome Donna ma'am to comment and interact with Professor Shruti Das. Professor Shruti Das, who was very instrumental in introducing Donna ma'am to this conference. I welcome you, ma'am, to interact with Professor Shruti Das. Thank you.
In fact, I would love her observations. She is a Langston Hughes scholar, and I am that we consider comments to be.
Well, if I may say a word or two, I put into the chat that this is a profoundly well researched and well documented presentation. You have covered Langston Hughes's work from his very earliest work through his later works, and by including the insights of scholars such as Faith Berry, you have brought in a perspective that is often overlooked. I just commend you. I think this was a very strong and impressive presentation. I would ask if you are familiar with the poems Langston Hughes wrote that are usually called the Madam poems. And if you are not yet familiar with them, I recommend them to you, especially in light of a strong woman's voice in the poems. So that is something to consider if you haven't done that yet.
Thank you very much, Akiva. I'm really overwhelmed and honored by your comment, and I will definitely read those poems because after reading, and I've been reading his poems for quite some time, and I really feel my blood boiling when I read African American poetry and literature because they are like the revolutionary Indian literature, the literature of the Dalit, where pain and the literature of the women of India, the rural India, not the elite women anywhere. So, even the writers of India who are not women but are in the rural pockets still suffer. The indigenous people of India still suffer. So, um, I will take up, and I will read all the other poems and take up the suggestion. Thank you very much, Africa. And thank you for staying up so late to listen to my paper. I'm absolutely honored, madam.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other participants would like to contribute?
Malot Mahendra wants to ask a question, ma'am.
Mahendra, you will ask a question. You're welcome.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to ask, ma'am. First, it was a very powerful and wonderful lecture. I am happy that I'm a part of it. And my question is, where do trans black women stand in the context of black feminism? We have seen some of the comments of wonderful writers like Adichie and also J.K. Rowling, which have their comments have come under the burn, claiming that their views on trans women are anti-trans. Wait. Hello, am I audible, ma'am?
Not very clear. Can you just ask me the question?
Hello.
Yeah, but Chimamanda Adichie is not African American. She is a Nigerian woman, and trans black women. Well, that's not that has not the area has not been explored by me as yet. So I don't know about trans black women. I am not a scholar of queer studies, so I wouldn't even be able to answer your question in the Indian context because I don't know about trans women here either. I mean, I've not read that, or none of my scholars have been working on it. One person cannot, research in so many things. So, Adichie is a fine writer, but from Nigeria. She writes about her Nigerian experience and her experience in America as a Nigerian. She has written about the Nigerian Civil War, but I don't see any trans women there. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Um, that would be my humble submission.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
We have another 10 minutes now. We can go ahead with discussion. Any offline participants would like to comment until we think about online, offline. This is not only
Ma'am, actually, Nibir sir is in.
two concepts of Shalom's just example.
Yes, ma'am, I'm checking and Nibir sir is in just now. Just now, Nibir sir joined the online session.
So if I have to ask you to elaborate on the concepts of transcendence and immanence. Find transcendence and immanence. Focus on Indian language. No, I was asking ma'am, requesting ma'am to elaborate on the concepts of Simon Debau's transcendence and immanence. The context of Indian feminism, which paved way for all feminisms in that one particular statement of concept.
Indian feminism is something very different from feminisms across the world. You see, the treatment of women in different cultures are different. I cannot say that Indian women have been always in all the Indian cultures because India is a multicultural, multilingual place. India cannot be homogenized. So the condition of the women in India cannot be homogenized. Yesterday I was talking to a friend from Iflu, and he was talking about how women in Andhra Pradesh sit along with the family. They work shoulder to shoulder with men, right? And they sit around in the evening eating and drinking together. That is the case in Punjab. But in other states of India, you wouldn't find that. So, these are typical regions. I do not see the kind of oppression that African American women uh, are subjected to. I do not find that in the Indian context at all. Maybe Dalit women, and that too, Dalit women in Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, in Bengal, but Dalit in Odisha are not that oppressed. They are not that tortured. They are a part of the mainstream because of the the historical religiosity of the space. Because for a long time, Odisha was under Buddhism. And that is why there is a kind of participation or a kind of, if not equal participation, there is some participation and there is not so much of apartheid or, subjugating the Dalit or, creating barriers for Dalit people and or the Christians or the Muslims or the Hindus. There is not so much of demarcation, discrimination. So it is a different kind of state. So for me, though you may call me from the mainstream, but I have my roots in the villages. I have not personally, I've traveled far and wide in Odisha. I have not seen this. But in Maharashtra, the Dalit problem is acute. And when you talk about transcendence, when you talk about immanence, this is very, very subjective and very, very culture specific and space specific. So if we cannot homogenize the Africanist experience or the African American experience with the Indian woman's condition or the Indian Dalit condition, they're very different. See, in certain states in India, the Dalit are lynched. How many women, because of their color, are lynched in India? Rape is not lynching. We should not confuse rape with lynching. Rape is power politics, so even lynching is power politics. But that is again different from public lynching because of the color of the skin. Women get opportunity, the reservation for women, and we do not, in India, we do not see that this woman is from Tamil Nadu, this woman is from Kerala, this woman is from Orissa, this is from Punjab or that. We do not discriminate like that. Or this woman belongs to a Brahmin caste, or this belongs to a Vaishya caste, or something like that. Women, we have, like all the women of the general caste, get the same kind of reservation. We have reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe and SEBC, OBC, all these things. So it is very complex and complicated in India, whereas in America, African American is African American. The women are definitely doubly oppressed because they have to face sexism as well. Whereas here, we do not have racism, we only have sexism.
Perspective, yes.
Sir, please mic because online listeners can listen to.
Please come in.
As Dona Harper and Nebisar is there now. No, sir, just take them. No.
Yeah. This is I mean, responding to your comment that when Dalit women or women in India go through a kind of operation, yeah, I think Sharila Rege's point has always been that the Savarna Academy, how the question of oppression is always known. Or, you know, whenever there is a reference to caste oppression, there is a tendency to invoke racial oppression in American context. And I think I will need to return to Rege's Sharila Rege's paradigm. Is her wonderful work, writing caste and writing gender. I think in the first introductory chapter, he exhaustively deals with this issue of how discrimination, you know, in terms of caste is something that the Indian, academia is not comfortable with. That's
Thank you so much, Dr. Christopher. My response to this comment would be a positive one, but one thing I see the same kind of opacity, the white, we call that the white opacity in for the marginalized classes in America, and I see the Savarna opacity, the male opacity here. Okay, I would not like to speak of my caste, but I belong to the upper caste people of India, and even we suffer. I, as a woman, I would say that even today, in being a university professor, I do suffer from Savarna opacity, male opacity, patriarchy as we call it, but it is there, it is a lived experience, it is there throughout the world, not only here, it is there, it is something that has been, women have always been treated as insignificant, and Races have been considered as insignificant, while corporates, while business people, while governments and miners take over land in Africa and in India and in various places of the world. The First Nations people have suffered, the indigenous people in India are suffering all the time. Their land is taken away for the resources. Andaman and Nicobar, the beautiful Andaman, the forests, they hardly exist anymore. Nicobar forests hardly exist anymore. The indigenous people there have been wiped away. So it is an opacity. Their death, their extinction is very insignificant in the face of power and in the face of capitalism. So that is another question altogether.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for all your answers and live discussion which happened until now. But I must submit that women in India, especially when we talked about Langston Hill's poetry and you made a mention of lived experience, the agony which we have for the lived experience of race in African American context doesn't continue in Indian context. Because when you consider Dalit women especially, there is triple marginalization. One, patriarchal, two, as a woman, and three, because of the Dalit context.
Right.
So we cannot deny the fact, we speak a lot about post-colonial theories which talk about the binaries and suppression that is happening around in the world, but we are least, most of us, or few of us at least, are least concerned about the issues which marginalize majority of the people in India, the maximum, the good percentage of Indian community which are suppressed on the basis of caste.
Well, I would contest this because, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with you, but since I live in a place which is populated by indigenous people of India, I would say that the indigenous woman or the indigenous person, the aborigine and the Adivasi, they suffer from, if you say that the Dalit people or the Dalit woman suffers from triple marginalization, these people suffer from quadruple or multiple marginalization. The Dalit oppress the indigenous people, and that is again considered as insignificant because if you go to Korakut, if you go to Kalahandi, if you go, which is called the Somalia of India, where they do not even get food to eat, they live on mango shells, mango seed shells, and they die of hunger, and nobody looks at them. They do not have a voice because they did not have an Ambedkar. They do not have a voice because nobody listens to them. They want the land, the resources, right? And we must look at everybody, not only the Dalit, and say that the Dalit are totally marginalized and the indigenous people are not, because majority of the land in Korakot, in Kalahandi, the lands of the indigenous people have been taken by certain caste of the Dalit. So I agree, Dalit are marginalized. Women of upper caste suffer terrible plight in the villages because of male dominance, because nobody looks at them. So women everywhere suffer. So they have a language of their own, which if you read Langston Hughes's poetry or the African American poetry, that is a message you should carry, that, they stay in the same symbolic order of the American language, or they speak the same language, and yet they bore from within. So unless the Dalit people bore from within, they cannot come out. So this is the plight of everybody in the world, any and every oppressed person in the world.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And perspective of Dalit is not only for the scheduled caste. In my perception, it is like suppressed. That's the reason I take as a.
Ambedkar has called Dalit means only the scheduled caste. Indigenous people are different. It is not perspective, it is a political definition. It is not a perspective at all, because I have spoken to Dalit leaders who do not who call only themselves Dalit. Dalit are those people, they are marginalized, they've suffered a lot, and my skin creeps, and I feel terrible when I read Limpale's autobiography, and when I read Bama, Skarupu, I read so many Urmila Power's interviews and Urmila Power's writings. Like you really think, where are we? In what world? What secularism are we talking about? What equality we are talking about?
Thank you very much. I think the debates go and go if you consider, but I conclude this session. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your very what interactive session.
5 minutes break.
And now the organizers say that we take break for 5 minutes and assemble at 11:30 for the paper presentations in the same hall. And I request all the online participants for your patient listening until now, especially Donna ma'am. Hope she's still there. I can't see you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shruti ma'am, for your.
Thank you all online and offline participants. Thank you, Akiba, very much. I don't know how to express my gratitude to you for being here. I feel so honored that you listened to my paper. Thank you.
Five minutes, sir. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes.
Thank you, Azam sir, for being here.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Unmute and talk. Yes.
Okay.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, one and all. Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, sir. Good morning, sir.
Hello. Good morning, one and all. I invite you all for this 3-day international conference. Major themes of Afro-American literature. Here, all of you know that how Afro-American literature has been emerging to explore the unheard voices, voice of voiceless, and silence of untold stories from men and women. And it has been constructing the idea of insurgency as well as self respect, dignity, and human concerns from different backgrounds. So, here, as we have the theme of this, will go for the paper presentations. Now, I invite one of the paper presenters to start presentation. Hello, can you hear me? Mohammed.
Hello, sir.
Yeah,
Good morning, sir.
yeah, very good morning. Start presentation, please.
Shall I turn on my camera, sir?
Yeah, yeah, please, please. You can, you can, please. Very, very good morning to see you, Mohammed.
Good morning, sir. Once again,
Yeah,
I, Muhammad Azam,
yeah.
Research Scholar, Department of English, Kakti University.
Okay, fine.
And first of all, I thank and I appreciate all the organizers of this prestigious conference. And I feel it's a great honor and opportunity to be a part of this seminar. My research topic is operation of black women in Toni Morrison's WS time. Let me continue my session. In the African American pantheon, black women writers have made major contributions to unraveling the desire for validation and identity. Philip Wheatley's legacy was continued by writers such as Jola Nera Huston, Dorothy West, resulting in the birth of Toni Morrison, Gloria Camara, Alice Walker, and Toni Morrison. She's a well-modern African American writer who has received lead honors. She is the most well-known and African American novelist to win the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature. She has been read a large percent of the African aging population and any other literature in the country's history. That's Toni Morrison, apart from other authors, is her positive attitude on life. Toni Morrison is famous for her African American heritage. She sought to piece together to the complicated lives of African and other men and women in African American who were living in a backward and neglected state. They were not only despised by Americans, white men and women, but they were also treated as if they were animals. She was far more concerned with the black community's well-being and advancement. In an interview with Salman Rushdie, she once said these keywords. I quote Toni Morrison, I'm not sure what the word Negro means, which is why I write books. What is black child, women, friend, mother? What is a black person? It seems to me that there are so many the important part is being the flirty contradictions. Kind of Tony, you beauty and I mean, not only depicts psychological weaknesses of young black people show an active presence in a world that challenges, devalues people's offer, race, and inspired conversation. Morrison is one that elementary issues as moving book. Technological beyond textbook, it challenges as a relational dominant
Hello,
ideals of
hello, ma'am.
femininity.
Hello, hello. It's not audible.
Yes, sir, it's
Your voice is not audible. Make it clear, please. Yeah,
oh, technical issue, yes, sir.
it's okay. Okay, yeah. Carry on.
I'll continue.
Because of technical glitch might have happened. Hello, can you hear me? Mahmood. Hello, Mahmood. Hello. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? No, that's the meeting. Okay.
Sir, is my voice audible?
Ah, now it's okay. Yeah,
Sir, some technical issue, sir.
it's okay. It's okay. Yeah,
Uh,
because of technical glitch, it might have disconnected. Yeah, please continue
okay,
your
sir.
presentation. Yeah.
Uh, Pecola, she yearns desperately to attain the traditional American ideals of feminine beauty, white complexion, blonde hair, and blue eyes, as she portrayed by popular culture, symbol, and rituals. WSI juxtaposes passage from the Dick and Jane Grammar School premiere with memories and stories of Pecola's life, alternatively told in retrospect by one of Pecola's now grown childhood friend and anybody, and by an omniscient writer in a fragmented narrative from multiple perspectives of the Black Arts movement in the late 1960s, such as Morrison's subsequent work. WSI has been widely regarded as a literary watershed, inspiring a proliferation of literature written by African American women about their identity and experiences as a woman of color. Its sensitive portrait of African American female identity and astute critic of the internalized racism bred by American cultural definitions of beauty has been widely regarded as a literary watershed, inspiring a proliferation of literature written by African American women about their identity and experience as women of color. The, the reading of Toni Morrison's work, WSI, gives the sense that the narrative intertwines the concerns of two primary topics. She delves into the tragedy of children's oppression or violation, particularly of impoverished children, as well as an issue unique to populations targeted by racism, internalized racism, that is. This is a form of thinking that occurs when members of a targeted group, in this case of African Americans, starts to accept stereotypes about themselves and feel that European Americans are superior in terms of beauty, morality, and intelligence. Morrison concentrates on the issues of internalized racism as though it were a problem that affects children. Internalized racism psychological mechanism is based on a cycle of oppression. The oppression of cycle is a complicated phenomena that impacts everyone who is affected by oppressive institutions, whether they are oppressors or victims. Because she is a child, the child is oppressed, she or he is incapable of combating or resisting injustice. She or he is trained to respond to injustice and pain with a variety of disempowered behaviors, including quiet, self abusive despair, and fury. When a kid grows up in an oppressive system, his or her position frequently transforms and he or she takes on the role of oppressor. This cycle is particularly evident when it comes to the oppression of children, but is also visible when it comes to the persecution of ethnic groups. The oppressors of Pecola in the bluest high have been harmed by repressive parents and her racial ideologies. Morrison is quick to stress out that individuals are not born with the desire to harm others. Rather, they are trained to do so when they are injured themselves. Morrison therefore addressed the importance of important issues of racism and sexuality among Black African residing in America. They were greatly ignored and exploited by white men and women in that vast country against black skinned people. She was well aware of and genuinely worried about and poverty, oppression, exploitation of Africans in the United States. As Friday has argued, she had a strong awareness of the interplay of race, gender, and class in this way. Indeed, the interest of the oppressors lie in charging the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppressed them, or the more than oppressed can be led adapt to that situation, the more easily they can be dominated. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Mahmood, for your excellent presentation. Shall we open for the discussion, interaction, or observations of your presentation, or shall we wait for a couple of other presentations to start? Yeah. Okay. So fine. No, whatever you had presented, it's very relevant to our major themes of Afro-American literature, as you quoted here, oppression of black women. Here, my question is, how many types of oppression you have seen in Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye? Can you?
Uh, okay, sir. Sir, in Toni Morrison's novel, we can find three types of oppressions in terms of class, race, and gender. Hello, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Please carry on.
Sir, three types of oppression or discrimination we'll find in Toni Morrison's novel, sir. One is gender. Being a woman, uh, she experienced injustice and atrocities by the hands of not only white men, and she also experienced the same thing from her own community people. That's gender discrimination. And class discrimination when it comes to most of the people, when people migrated from South Africa to America, they were treated inhuman and they were treated as second class citizens. Even they were not treated as human beings. This type of class discrimination we can find in African American peoples. And in the third one, race discrimination. uh, Mostly here we'll find blacks and whites. This type of discrimination we'll find in African Americans. Actually, the people who are migrated to America, not they were not treated as Americans. They were treated as second class citizens, and they were treated as African Americans. African Americans, especially the people uh, who are living in Kentucky and Lorraine, Ohio, and they wanted to rebuild their history and they wanted to raise their voice. They wanted to give their voice by narrating their stories and by creating a voice and space to the black literature. So, like before Toni Morrison, there were many writers who explored and who raised their voice against injustice and oppression, like whatever the names which I mentioned earlier before my presentation. Jola Nera Huston, Philip Waitley, and Gloria Naylor, and one more thing, Imamu Amiri Baraka, Black Arts Movement, and Rosa Park. All people raise their voice in terms of all the oppressions.
Okay, fine. Did you
So,
find the use of the language at
so,
the time of the oppression of men and women in different contexts? What kind of language they used to oppress the people? You said that physically, gender-wise, and migration, and within the blacks also, there was an oppression. Did you find the use of the language according to the context? Have they changed that kind of language in terms of the men and women? Did you get my point? Did you?
sorry, sir, I'm not aware of that, sir.
Okay, okay. So here, when they are going to oppress somebody else, they may use explanatory words and then unquote words to treat them with that kind of racism or gender or inhuman. So here, language makes sense of that oppression as a tool to oppress the people psychologically.
Yes,
So that
yes.
language also matters in terms of the oppression.
Language also plays important roles.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's what you should see that the way how each and every context is related to the use of the language. Your presentation is excellent, but the thing is, you should see that as a literature student, the use of the language in terms of the oppression, psychologically or physically or gender wise, or you said that within the blacks that kind of oppression was there. So can you refer one of the contexts of that blacks within the blacks there was an oppression?
Sir,
No, within the blacks there was an oppression.
sir.
You said that, yeah. Did you find that kind of oppression within the blacks, black women and men?
So oppression, there were different types, sir. One is
You
abusive.
said that,
One may be abusive language. One may be physical torture and molestation, and denying their rights, civil rights, and they were not allowed to, like, suppression of and reduction of their civil rights.
yeah, what is the scope of your research paper? Your whatever you present in the paper, bluest eye. What would be the scope, and what are you going to advise? And what is the new direction to overcome the oppression by the whites?
Uh, so
I
let us treat them as equally as human beings, our fellow human beings. That is one thing, sir. And let us provide opportunities in each and every field for them, like employment opportunities and educational opportunities, and let us make them to utilize all the resources, whatever the resources which are available for every human being, by providing basic necessities and treating them human
no,
beings.
for
That is
instance,
the ultimate.
all of us are in India, third
Sir,
world country like India. If you
sir,
look at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's ideology and social criticism, is it
sir.
possible to avoid this kind of oppression by accessing the equal opportunities to all treatment equally? Is it possible to overcome this kind of oppression in India and in America? Do you think that?
Sir, some certain level we can bring positive and democratic changes in the society, sir, by providing certain opportunities. But the entire system have to cooperate, and the people, institutions, and the democratic system has to involve, and each and every system has to involve in this process, sir. One cannot
What kind
even
of
we can, sir, one cannot bring all the changes. The entire system has to involve, sir. But we can bring certain levels some changes, sir.
through what movement or literature? as a literature
Sir,
and through literature, is it possible?
could you repeat, sir?
Through literature, do you mean to say, or movements?
Sir,
Through literature or movements?
movement, sir.
No, movements. I'm talking about the movements.
Sir,
Okay, so yeah. So thank you.
sir, thank you, sir. This is my first presentation, sir. I'm not aware of anything, sir. This is my first presentation,
Okay, okay. Welcome, welcome.
and I thank all the organizers, sir, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, running close under the. Hello, 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 hello. Good morning. Hello, hello, hello. Malod Mahendra.
Oh,
Mahendra, are you there? Mahendra, are you there?
yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Now I invite you for the presentation of your topic. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Good morning, everybody. I'll begin my project, my paper quickly. The title of my paper is Storytelling as a Bridge Between History and Memory, a study of James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk and Toni Morrison's Beloved. If history is the study of the past as the documented facts about an old house, storytelling is the story of the people who lived and are living in that house as individuals and as a community. Storytelling is the door which helps us see the inner intricacies of an individual and a community without oversimplifying it and erasing individuality. This paper aims to explore the scope of storytelling, especially in the fictional narratives, in bridging the gap between history and memory and their inevitable implications of both on the present, mainly focusing on James Baldwin's If Beale Could Talk and Toni Morrison's Beloved. Margaret Garner and her family had escaped enslavement in January 1856 by traveling across the frozen Ohio River to Cincinnati, but they were apprehended by U.S. Marshals acting under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. She killed her own daughter rather than allowing the child to be returned to slavery. Garner's story was the inspiration for Toni Morrison's Beloved. Emmett Till, a young black boy in Mississippi, turned 14 on July 25, 1955, sorry. Almost exactly 1 month later, he was brutally murdered after being accused of sexually harassing Carolyn Brandt, a white woman in a grocery store. The two white men accused of his murder were later found not guilty by an all white, all male jury. 6 decades later, Brandt admitted that she had lied. Brandt has never faced any legal consequences for her accusations against Till. In 1974, James Baldwin published his 13th book and fifth novel, If Beale Street Could Talk, which was not inspired by Emmett Till's case exactly. There wasn't and still isn't a single case to take inspiration from for the subject matter, such as of If Beale Street Could Talk. There are many more than one might want to know. If Beale Street Could Talk follows a 19-year-old girl who was Christine Clementine but was called Tish, in love with Alonzo, who was called Fawny, a young sculptor. Tish and Fawny pledge to get married, but Fawny is falsely accused of a terrible crime and imprisoned. Their family set out to clear his name, and as they face an uncertain future, Tish realizes that she is pregnant with Fawny's child. The young lovers experience a kaleidoscope of emotions, despair, and hope. In a love story that evokes the blues, where passion and injustice are inevitably intertwined, Baldwin creates two characters so alive and profoundly human that their story still mirrors the American psyche and the treatment of black people. Toni Morrison's Beloved is the story of Seth, who was born in slavery and escaped Sweet Home, the beautiful farm where she lived as a slave for so many years, where so many terrible and unspeakable things happened to her. In Ohio, her new life is full of hope, but 18 years later, she is still not free. Seed's new house has long been troubled by the angry, destructive ghost of a baby who died nameless and whose tombstone is engraved with a single word, beloved. When a mysterious teenage girl arrives calling herself beloved, Seed's terrible secret of the past leaks into the present and threatens to drown her world. Combining the visionary power of legend with the unassailable truth of history, Morrison's unforgettable novel is one of the great and enduring works of American literature. Set almost a century apart, the two novels, Beloved and If Beale Street Could Talk, present the American society where the black people still face racial hostility. The plight of slavery that forced Seed to cut her own baby's throat only transformed into racism and puts Fonny behind the bars without a fair trial because of his skin color. Toni Morrison and James Baldwin's texts have been instrumental in understanding American society and its racial past and present through the narratives that range from social realism to folklore embedded narratives that present the lives of African American people, their histories, struggles, and unyielding resilience in the face of brutal oppression. Their narratives that are vibrantly human also pose the questions for the society at large. Toni Morrison, in her Nobel acceptance speech, said, and I quote, oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. And through their writings, James Baldwin and Toni Morrison played a major part in creating a language that is unique to the African American writing. The story of Seed isn't hers alone. It's a story that resonates with the horrors of slavery, an unforgettable, integral part of American history. And the story of Tish and Fonny is also the story of many black families cruelly torn apart with indifferent racial prejudices. And in writing about these important matters, the fact alone is not enough because fact can only go so far. It will inform, present the image of the horror, and perhaps even prick at one's conscience. But storytelling has the power of imagination combined with empathy. And in the case of black writers, it is even a necessity, a rage against the silence that can only be satiated after understanding, because knowing is not enough. Storytelling makes the image move on the landscapes of the past and present. It gives the image life, a background, a home, or even the absence of it. Arundhati Roy wrote in the second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, how to tell a shattered story. By slowly becoming everybody? No, by slowly becoming everything. Storytelling also gives the reader a space to become everything, and to understand one has to see the sharp edge of the butcher's knife before it slits Beloved's throat. One has to truly see Alonzo, who is called Fani for all that he is before he is put behind the bars on false charges. One has to know the shape of the iron bit and the taste it leaves behind after it is removed from an enslaved person's mouth. And storytelling is the bridge that allows one, both the writer and the reader, to walk across the landscapes of history and memory and remember for one's own self and the society at large through the act of remembering. Seeth, while talking to her daughter, Denver says, some things go, pass on, some things just stay. I used to think it was memory. I used to think it was rememory. Some things you forget, other things you never do. But it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone. But the place, the picture of it stays. And not just in my memory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture of floating around out there outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. It is through this language that is undeniably original and personal that Toni Morrison managed to bring the pre-Civil War America alive with all the horrors that black people faced in slavery and their humanity rising above their living conditions. The, the universality of the subject matter to the slavery as whole doesn't come at the cost of reducing the individuality of the characters in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Every character is etched with uniqueness. Even the supernatural elements are presented with a seamless mastery that they don't stick out like the orange patches against the darkness of the quilt of baby sucks. They feel as natural as everything else. James Baldwin's If Beale Could Talk is a love story at heart. It shows two young lovers, Tish and Fonny, holding on to each other as the cruel racial prejudices tear them apart. James Baldwin's seemingly simple story oscillates between hope and despair as the fates of the young lovers face the racially segregated American society. Sharon Rivers, Tish's mother, tells her, Just remember, love brought you here. If you trusted love this far, don't panic now. Fani, falsely accused of rape, spends his days in jail with the defeatism after almost all the efforts and attempts of his family failed to acquit him of the crime he did not commit. His only source of joy remains Tish and their upcoming baby. James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk is fictional, but it's grounded in reality of the American society, where more than half of death row exonerates are black. Nearly half the people currently on death row are black. Half of the 2,725 people exonerated since 1989 are black. Innocent black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder than innocent white people. It takes longer to exonerate an innocent black person. Police misconduct occurred in more than half of all wrongful murder victims cases involving innocent black people. About one third of unarmed people killed by black police are black. Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched. In our era, it is not enough to be tolerant. Isabel Wilkerson says in her uh, recent book Cast, you tolerate mosquitoes in the summer, you rattle in an engine, the grey slush that collects at the crosswalk in winter. You tolerate what you would rather not have to deal with and wish would go away. It is no honor to be tolerated. Every spiritual tradition says love your neighbor as yourself, not tolerate them. African American writing has given many wonderful writers to the world, from Du Bois to Colson Whitehead and Gwendolyn Brooks to Jasmine Ward, and a wonderful tradition of storytelling that is diverse and innovative. James Baldwin and Toni Morrison are perhaps two of the finest writers of their generation, not just in the context of American literature, but in the world literature in general. Their works remain relevant, characters they created and the stories they wrote still reflect the American society in all its beauty and ugliness. Storytelling gives shape, color, and structure to history. It keeps memory alive, bridges the gap between the memory, both personal and shared, and history. It gives voice to the silenced and unheard. It brings back the dead so that they can speak their untold story to the present. This voyage through the time, however painful, horrifying, and enraging, must be taken in order to not forget not just the statistical and objective facts of history, but the burden of memory, the lived experience of past that still persists in the present. Storytelling consoles, strengthens the will when it fails, and helps one stand up to the indifferent gaze and humiliating hand of the oppressor.
Hello, Mahendra. Can you conclude your paper,
Yes,
please?
sir. It is done, sir. Thank you.
Done? Yeah, welcome. Now it's open for questions, observations, and insightful comments. Can any one of you pose a question, please, here from the online and offline participants? Any one of you, please. Yeah, Mahendra. No, as you said here, storytelling is a narrative. So, what kind of mode they had the voice of voiceless, silence of untold stories, the narration of their voice, is it oral or written by the both writers?
Sir, in African American tradition of storytelling, oral tradition has been kind of, it was original. Storytelling came to them orally originally. So if I can cite this example of Isabel Wilkerson's first book, uh, uh, the the warmth of the other sons, she collects the orally collected stories and experiences of the black people who migrated from south to the north. So this has always been the case, like where.
Here, Mahinder, you know,
Yes, sir.
the oral, nomadic tribes storytelling
Yes, sir.
and the voice is very limited if it is, oral narration.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Then if it is a script written, then it will be, reach to large, number of readers.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So the voice of voiceless of the, writers here narrated the story from personal to political. Is it? What?
Uh, Sir, I would like to just quote Toni Morrison, where she says that there is nothing personal. There is no watertight division between what is personal and what is political. So I
But
think narration, like especially when it comes to stories like African American people telling their experiences, it is inherently political, whatever they are speaking, because uh, the systems of public life and their personal lives are like inevitably intertwined.
So here, do you think that James Baldwin's Street Could Talk and Morrison's Beloved are similar in terms of the storytelling? Because here, Street Could Talk here it is inclusive at crossroads. It is at public place, and if you look at Toni Morrison's Beloved, it is a private narrative. Do you think the similarities between these two writers?
Yes, sir, absolutely. There are similarities, and also there is this uniqueness to it, because James Baldwin's novel is set in like 1950s, no, sorry, 1970s, and Toni Morrison's Beloved is set in 1800s, right? So we can cite these two novels which are set in different times and understand how the concept of racial prejudice, or he hasn't gone through much change that is necessary. And Toni Morrison's way of storytelling is folklorish. Some people call it magic realism, but in James Baldwin's case, it's social realism.
Okay, so here, you said that history and memory. So between these two writers, I think there are gaps of history as well as the memory. Did you find similarities between these two writers because of the gaps of the history and the memory?
Uh, Sir, what I believe is that to bridge that gap, a writer is the writing a story is just the halfway. The story gets finished when the reader reads it. So it's sort of a mutual path that one has to cross. No, it's a path that both the reader and the writer takes. So the bridging the gap involves also the reader and contextualizing in the current scenario of what we are reading.
So
So
here, are you generalizing the readership of Toni Morrison's and James Baldwin? For instance, a non-African reader maybe indifferent of their narratives of the storytelling. And if you look at the implied reader, inscribed reader, and a reader against the grain, so there will be difference between the African readers and non-African readers. Do you find this kind of gaps of reading by the African and non-African readers?
yes, sir. A reader brings in his own experience when he approaches the story. Uh, so I believe that there will be gaps, but to read a text like just as it is not enough. We have to understand the background that is written in, so that we understand that context, because everything is a part of discourse, especially when we are talking about African American literature. They are an integral part of the racial discourse. So to try to understand these texts without understanding that discourse will be not complete, I think.
So thank you,
Thanks.
Mahinder. Thank you for your excellent presentation and
Thank you, sir.
patience. Okay, thank you. Right. we'll start the presentations of this session. Now I invite Dr. Hanuman, Associate Professor, Department of English, Andhra University. Now we can start the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. The title of my paper is Black and White, Composing Meaning in Octavia Butler's Kindred. I particularly liked Butler's Kindred because for my research I focused on, one of the writers I focused was on Kurt Vonnegut, and Kurt Vonnegut speaks on, he uses the technique of time travel and a lot of science fiction elements. And when I read this novel Kindred, that is what has caught my attention, and the present paper will focus on these elements. So this novel originally was written in 1979, and it takes slavery graphically, and it condemns what was unjust. Butler's powerful narrative prose is in top form to illustrate modern readers the horrors of slavery, and in this setting too, the contrast life in early 1800s with life now. Kindred can also be seen as a metaphor for today's culture, with the scars of slavery and racial consciousness still visible in a society that refuses to heal. Butler, on one hand, demonstrates how, as a nation and people, America is linked as kindred across races and history. Diana is a strong female protagonist developed by Butler, whose strength and perseverance are inspiring, heightened by the fact that she has a unique point of view. Diana becomes a symbol of the current African American woman, empowered by history, yet damaged by past wrongdoings in some ways. The purpose of this study is to investigate Butler's concept of making meaning in kindred. It also concentrates on restrictive concepts such as slavery, which are used as oppressive techniques, especially against women. Diana, the heroine of Butler's novel, is a contemporary African American woman who is teleported back in time to save her ancestor Rufus. In the piece, she uses first-person narrative to provide the reader an intimate experience of life as a slave. In the narrative, Diana and her white husband, Kevin, are transported to the year 1850, and they cannot afford to negate the responsibilities of staying alive, even if it was like concubinage. The ease with which people fall into these positions contributes to a more favorable view of a society. Kindred is a result of a two-decade argument about how African American history should be shown. Literary critic Lisa Page, in her article, Kindred Spirit, science fiction author Octavia Butler, mentioned that, I quote, Octavia Butler was a paradox. She was a visionary who melted the boundaries of popular fiction. As a writer, she was bold enough to change the entire landscape of science fiction. As a person, however, she was intensely shy. Unquote. Butler has established herself as a major new voice in science fiction, even though her books are often difficult to come by. Butler was influenced by the popular science fiction and African American experience of her time in her writings. Science fiction gave her the literary freedom to discuss the problems she was passionate about. For her, science fiction has always been a haven and a source of solace. In this context, Sarah Lefanu comments, I quote, science fiction is by its narrative interrogative and open, unquote. Butler has expressed her displeasure with male accounts of African American history. In an interview with John Snyder, Butler described Kindred as, quote, a dark fantasy novel that drills down into the prickly core of American history, unquote. Shiri Thomas notes that science fiction cliches like parallel planets, invisibility, and the encounter with the alien other have been employed by authors since Ralph Ellison and Auden. E.P. Du Bois wrote that Kindred aims to dissociate readers from dominant understanding of American history and to illustrate the impact and influence of Black existence on society. Diana, the protagonist of Kindred, is a budding African American novelist in the modern day California. Diana is inexplicably transported through space and time to the Wayland farm in antebellum Maryland, where she confronts her slave past black woman to ensure her own birth. Diana appears to be split between two grim possibilities when she is kidnapped as a slave. Either she suffers brutal and discreet demands and therefore perpetuates her family line, or she refuses this demand and risks never being born. Diana, and by extension Butler's readers, must come to perceive history as a narrative production process to resolve this temporal paradox. Butler employs the science fiction cliché of time travel in the quest of kindred to question the formation of historical memory, particularly in its commercialized form. Such devices, as Daniel Broderick points out, allows authors to show how, quote, no element of our own reality can be counted on to remain as given, unquote. Despite the fact that ideological analysis may readily locate precisely here, representations of those features rendered invisible by power and usage even as they dictate our lives. Kindred is a fascinating site for looking into and re-establishing the generational continuum as well as the different meanings of slavery's heinous experience. It is a narrative about black and white women and their roles in society. Furthermore, Kindred indicates that slavery still has an impact on modern society, and science fiction serves to underline this. Kindred not only articulates the persistent psychological, physical, social, and repercussions of slavery, but also provides a road to rehabilitation through the imagery form of the new slave story. Slavery is a significant issue that must not be overlooked. Kindred, on the other hand, uses time travel to fuse the mystical with uh, realism norms, resulting in a work that is part historical fiction, part slave tale, and part the story of how a 20th century black woman comes to terms with slavery as a role and her nation's past. In fact, just to mention here, this particular novel is widely read in many schools in the United States. Uh, it is not a very it is not though it is not considered as a very complex and highly intellectual kind of novel, but still, since it throws light on the slavery that has existed over several centuries, it forms an important part. One thing which fascinated me the most about the novel was how the writer, Octavia Butler, uses this wonderful medium of science fiction, the time travel technique, to in fact go into the past as if she was present there. I mean, this is also mostly depicted in a lot of movies these days. But this technique helps. Imagine, like, we can also travel back to 1947 and maybe watch how independence was declared. Maybe movies to some extent provide us this. But the novel, since Butler uses first person narrative, she helps us to travel along with her and see firsthand how brutal and how harsh slavery has always been on the lives of people, particularly the Africans who were brought there as slaves, because they were just like domesticated animals. They just had to adhere. All of us know this brutal, sad story of the African American history. So Dana's day-to-day life on the whaling plantation allows the audience to understand the complexities of slavery. They observe how white masters abuse black slaves, treating them like animals and forcing them to live a life of suffering and sadness, and how this affects both slaves and plantation owners, giving this 19th century practice of exploitation new meaning and realism. Unlike most slaves, Kindred allows readers to experience the servitude alongside the protagonist rather than simply connecting with the memories of an enslaved. Dana takes the reader on a journey through time, through life-threatening scenarios such as attempted rape, and most importantly, through her thoughts on the fragility of every slave. Because obviously, slaves, their lives were never considered. They were treated like cattle, and their lives were never had any. We see similar kind of reflections also in our Indian history, but I'll just confine this. After each journey between the two eras, Dana tells her husband Kevin and the readers, because her husband happens to be a white man, and there is a total difference. Visiting history as using the technique of time travel helps her to look at various shades. So I'm concluding. Butler humanizes the past by contextualizing the antebellum South's social and emotional qualities. She studies and judges slavery from the standpoint of a free black woman, as well as explaining its complexities to black Americans. The development of both relatable black and white characters in the novel about slavery is a break from what many readers have come to expect from a story about slavery. The characters, whether black or white, are humanized to the point have major flaws and abilities. According to Butler, Diana's past wound, as it stands at the end of the novel, is not something that can be completely healed, in the sense that it can be made to vanish, according to Butler. Instead, it can be addressed and the pain can be relieved. The scars will stay apparent, just as any wound will, but overcoming the difficulty that created them can bring individuals who are still suffering together. Dana and Kevin reach a historical conclusion that will have an impact on the future. Finally, they grasp why race is still an issue in their time, as well as some of the steps that must be taken to start the healing process. Thank you all very much.
So thank you for the excellent presentation.
I mean, I can take one or two questions.
Yeah, now it's open for discussion, interaction.
Okay, the time travel technique. In fact, my specialization is not really in the African American history, but my reading and my understanding, what it taught me was when we use this and when we can travel to places and situations, because it helps us to look at reality. It helps us to feel because we live there. We feel like while reading the novel, what really touched me or what helped me understand. Native American history. I mean, I'm not able to recall the title of the story, but how this man uses how Native Americans were painted as feminine, like effeminate or not manly, weaklings. So the the reality of the situation. Because listening to like the someone suffering is something, and actually experiencing with them is an altogether different feeling altogether. And this one can experience while reading a novel like Stop it. Hello. Is it distorted? Right. I was just reminded of just a thought came to me. Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s series, the television serial, Finding One's Roots, where he brings in, archival material, okay, letters, and then, all the memorabilia, and visit those places, those graves, and also, I think it's an experience, right? Going back and trying to reconstruct or retrace. That to me was a fascinating exercise that Henry Louis Gates Jr. did. Just an observation. Yes, it's almost like the existential dilemma that most of us are in. Like we are in some stage, we have money or we have some position, and then when we try to look back into roots where we are from and what exactly has happened, so there is this total kind of an, I would say, both a disconnect and a connect, because we tend to I mean, the situations and the times were totally different. Especially if you look at a country like India, we had, all of us know this fact that we had a lot of issues there regarding caste, the region, etc. Particularly caste and religion dominated our land, but when it comes to a place like the US, the history of slavery is more, I think I would say, is quite traumatizing. Yes, sir. I think in one way it is quite fascinating. On the other way, it has more negatives. But still, I think that is the truth of the matter.
But you cannot forego even if you are going to achieve any professional bureaucratic identity because of our whatever the caste and rules. We have to remain. I think here Saran Kumar was outcast um, aesthetics. In that he says we may achieve anything, but we cannot forego the identity of our roots. we invite the next speaker to enter. So please do come.
I'm B. Madhavi. I was a scholar from Osmania University, and today's my subject is on black slaves, and my paper name title is Exploring the Experiences of Black Slave Women through Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harry Jacobs. Slavery is terrible for men, but it's more terrible for women. As such, an African American women writer, Harriet Jacobs, in her autobiographical work, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written under the pseudonym of Linda Bent, which is published in 1861. Women slave experiences are strikingly different from men slave experiences. Millions of helpless women, black women, were sold in the auction block and worked under the most deplorable conditions. Suppressing black slave women reproduce a lot of children. They go to work in the fields because their black bodies considered as super bodies. So, and they believe that black bodies do not experience any pain. That's why they consider as they are super bodies, unlike any white women or any other women. Here, Harriet Jacobs depicts the horrified incidents as family separations, sexual harassment, inhuman work culture in plantations, and economical exploitation. So, here my paper unpacks the cruel treatment of slave masters and their mistresses towards slave people, and Linda's struggle for emancipation, herself as well as her children, from the curse of the slave. Here, autobiography is the most significant literary work in African American literature. For former slaves, they recorded their slave experiences in number of books, such as autobiographies of Patrick Douglas and Up from Slavery. That's an autobiography by Booker T. Washington, Entire Women, Black Women and Feminism by Bell Hooks, and our discussed work, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Ann Jacobs. Such works talks about their harsh experiences uh, recorded in their autobiographies. Harriet Jacobs' memoir was composed between 1853 to 1858, and she explores the quest for emancipation and events of sexual violence that female black slaves endured during the slavery period. She was born as a slave girl in Edenton, North Carolina. Harriet ever wanted to be free to get her freedom, and she started to resist her family, to resist her white masters, and she encountered many obstacles. In her slave narratives, names were changed, and real names were not used. Here, white slave master real name is Dr. Malcolm, which is changed as Dr. Flint. Harriet opens her story. Her opinion is that her mother's that she became completely alone, and she's telling that we are not at all. It's wrong if we treated ourselves as a human being. And in her childhood, it went a very pleasant way. And Harriet's grandmother, Aunt Marthy, was very courageous and generous woman. Her strongest wish was only to purchase her children. As Harriet grew older, sexual abuses had been experienced by her cruel slave master, Dr. Flint, and also she was refused to marry whom she loved. just because white masters believe that these black slave women are completely their property. And Harriet, at the age of 22, in order to escape from the slavery, she hid in an attic with a small space without ventilation or any light for 7 years. During these years, she was separated from her two children. Only she could see and she could hear them, but she couldn't meet their children, her children. The most heart-rending stories of slavery consist in sale and separations of family members, and beloved children have been described in their slave narratives. Harriet, runaway slave, hid for 7 years without her children. Thought of leaving her children is one very heartbroken for any mother. Helpless mother couldn't save her son. Harriet recalls one of her distressing incidents here. She's saying like this: one day, the screams of a child nerved me with strength to crawl to my peeping hole, and I saw my son covered with blood. A fierce dog, usually kept chained, had seized and bitten him. A doctor was sent for, and I heard groans and screams of my child while the wounds were being sealed up. Oh, what torture to a mother's heart to listen to this and be unable to go to him. Though Dr. Flint was haunting her continuously, Harriet wasn't found out. Mr. Sands, father of Harriet's two children, when she heard about the marriage of Mr. Sands, she worried about the future of her children. She found a way to meet Mr. Sands secretly, and he assured her to protect her children, Benny and Ellen. Ellen was her daughter. And Sands decided to send her daughter Ellen to one of his relatives' house as a maid. Little daughter, Harriet met her little daughter Ellen and spent one whole night with her. Their emotional encounter was extremely disturbing for us. Harriet's little daughter Ellen was exciting about her new place and also saddened with the separation of her family members. Here, Harriet is saying, Ellen was saying to her mother, Mother, grandmother says I ought not to cry, that I am going to a good place where I can learn to read and write, and that by and by I can write her a letter. But I should have Benny or grandmother or Uncle Philip or anybody to love me. Can't you go with me, my dear mother? Harriet not only had a fear of her safety now, she also having the safety of her daughter Ellen. I hugged my daughter very close to my throbbing heart, and tears, too sad for such young ones to shed, flowed down her cheeks as she gave her last kiss and whispered in my ear, Mother, I will never tell, and she never did. Helpless mother couldn't make any promises to her child. With her throbbing heart and tears, she kissed Ellen. Harriet was worried about Ellen. Already months passed, but no news from her. Then she sent a letter to Brooklyn in the name of her grandmother. Unfortunate mother was extremely disturbed until she received an answer, as Ellen arrived safely. And white masters completely they treated this black female slaves and black men as inhuman. Here, one incident is showing like this. Former fugitive slave Harriet is also sharing her master forced one of the black enslaved women to eat food that had killed his pet dog because he believed that the black woman's stomach was stronger than the dog. Following example illustrates their unfair treatment towards the black slaves. Here, Harriet is saying when her father died in her childhood, this incident happened. I thought I should be allowed to go to my father's house and in the next morning, but I was ordered to go for flowers that my mistress's house might be decorated for an evening party. I spent the day gathering flowers and weaving them into festoons, while the dead body of my father was lying within a mile of me. What cared my owners for that? He was merely a piece of property. Moreover, they thought he had spoiled his children by teaching them to feel that they were they were human beings. So it is their mistakes if they treated themselves as human beings. Likewise, white masters ever thinking. Powerful white masters treated their slaves without mercy. Their black bodies were tortured. Black slaves were frequently hunted like the wild animals in the forest. Whipped and stripped were common punishments for their silly mistakes. Now, they were subjected as sacred objects. Usually, women considered as inferior humans, and here double discrimination was confronted with black women by their white masters. Black women slaves were exploited sexually by their white slaveholders during the institution of their slavery. Harriet opines that sexual harassment happens to be more burdensome than the bitter conditions which are experienced by male black slaves working on the plantation. So here white black women are facing double discrimination as compared with the male. Male only face the burdensome events or incidents in their only working places as they lived. But here they are both the way in their working place as well as in their as they were the maids of their white families. Harriet is a mulatto girl. Dr. Flynn obsessed with her, followed her, and trying to have sex with her. Vulnerability of a young black slave girl was disclosed with the secret sexual advancements of Dr. Flint. Harriet was Dr. Flint's own property now. Here, white masters considered their slaves as their property, and rape was not a crime for them. I now entered Harriet's lines on this. I now entered on my 15th year, a sad epoch in the life of a slave girl. My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. Entering into the teenage is a dreadful stage in the life of a slave girl. In the institution of slavery, slave teenage girls exposed to many traumas and bad living conditions, lack of medical treatment, and poor diet, etc. In her narrative, Harriet stated that black slave teenage girls were paid high cost because these girls were subjected to the sexual harassments by all the members of white master's family. Here, Benjamin was a runaway slave. While he stands at auction block, he was only paid $300. On this incident, here slave trader is stating this. Slave trader said he would give any price if the handsome lad was a girl. Immediately, Harry thanked God that Benjamin was not a girl. Young black abandoned girls were abused sexually, and in that society, people all around her were observing the same, but they never respond, which leads to mental agony. The mulatto woman was depicted as a seductress whose beauty drove white men to rape her. Some white masters just had a natural desire for mulatto and black women. Female black slaves' sexuality was observed by the white masters, especially their black bodies were innately licentious and hypersexual, which is called as jejegul. Black women considered as seductress with unquenchable desires. Here, chapter 6 deals with the Mrs. Flynn's jealous vulnerability of a black slave girl without her fault, how she was tortured by her jealous white mistress, Mrs. Flint, though Harriet was a very loyal slave, became an object of her mistress's envy and hatred. Powerless white mistresses had no control over their husbands' illicit affairs. As a result, These jealous mistresses inflicted physical harassments and emotional abuses on black slave women's vengeance. Now, status of childbearing enslaved
Please, can
women.
you conclude your paper?
Yeah, sure. So, about the condition of the mothers of black slaves, here I quoted one situation of Sethi. Sethi was a prominent character in the novel of Beloved. Sethi married Hali and gave birth to three children. Very cruel school teacher, became the master of sweet home after the death of Mr. Garner. The sadistic school teacher treated the slaves like animals. Sadie was a slave in the sweet home and later she escaped to Cincinnati. Sadie was so scared about the hellish life of slavery and just to protect her child from this brutal institution, Sadie tried to kill all her children, but she killed only one daughter named Beloved. Denver took her mother's milk right along with the blood of her sister. So, Sadie supports her cruel deed of killing her daughter, Beloved, as the daughter was escaped from the trauma of slavery. Sadie felt it was her duty to protect her daughter from this hellish life of slavery. Children were being separated from their mothers by cruel slave holders. Normally, parents love their children, right? So, I would like to conclude the session by saying black female bodies have undergone years and years of physical and psychological harassments. Those women were manipulated as homemade cooks, sexual servants, and to produce many more children to continue the next slave generation. Our society customarily expects vulnerable people such as queer people, slaves, and helpless women to be silent. But historical documents speak a lot about the sexual advancements and inhuman treatments of slave white masters. As legally, slave bodies belong to their masters, and black female exploitation is very common in the Antiquarian. The institution of slavery had transformed over the course of decades, and understanding the conditions of development of the slave communities in America is very crucial to remember and recognize the racial and economical discrepancies. So, with this.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Now it's open for questions and clarifications, interaction with the paper presenter, any kind of observation. Yeah, please. Yeah, right. A good paper, and I was just reminded of one thing when you said that it's important to remember, okay, slavery as an institution and its legacy and its after effect. So in the American context, what I want to draw attention to the fact that in the schools, there is, you know, Black History Week. Every year, there is a Black History Week, and students, both black and white, they make presentations on slavery. Okay, so I think that is something very important. In the European context, you have school children and younger generations reminded of the Holocaust in Germany. So they are taught, they are, they are not allowed to forget the injustices that have been, done. I think in the Indian context, it's very important that we remember that crimes have been committed against people here, and I think that's something that we need to think about. Are we doing that? Are we ignoring the fact, or are we trying to, remind ourselves of celebrated like doomsday. Slavery should be, demolished. It should be annihilated. Then only, we'll have the liberty, equality, and fraternity. Otherwise, it will remain, stereotypical. And there should be a break of the narration of the slavery from the historical background of the Afro-American writers. And as and when you have been presenting the relevance of the gender and society, family, do you find any kind of difference between the white woman and black woman in one of the context of your literary text in terms of the treatment of the black woman by the white woman? For instance, in India, mother-in-law is quite against to daughter-in-law. Though it is in the family, there both of them are women. In terms of here, black woman and white woman, do you find that kind of treatment of the equality or inequality in any context, and the use of the language in terms of the oppression of the black woman by the whites, men and women? So please, can you refer one of the contexts in terms of the language and gender, family, society? So thank you.
Yes, sir. In my observations, that's why I mentioned about Mrs. Prince, how she was jealous, and she's also a helpless wife. And her white husband is there, and she knew that in the black maid enters into her teenage. Now she's white. Wife was completely insecure, and she was unable to control her husband's deeds. That is why she increased. She developed the jealous and the envious towards her maid, and physical harassment and the mental torture was taking place just because of another white woman. So it's quite common whenever we read black and white, because completely black is inferior. It was treated as inferior till now. How many are right? Thank you.
Thank you for your excellent response. Yeah, we invite the next paper to enter, please. Last.
Julie and the personalities on and off. The title of my paper is African American Writings Explore Mental Release of a Poet. Biologically, man and woman are segregated. So both literature of man and literature of women, now what is called as feminist literature, as such is seen. And for ages, literature of man prevails as literature of mankind. But over the last 7 decades, feminist literature as a voice of women is seen occupying its due place in human history. Similarly, the civilization is segregated into white civilization and black civilization. Henceforth, the English literature cannot be separately viewed without the backdrop of these respective civilizations. In the present paper, I strive to shed light on some of the African writers, namely Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison, whose literary work happened to instill dictum, black is beautiful. I repeat, whose literary work happened to instill the dictum, black is beautiful. When one speaks of African American writers, the reference undoubtedly points to Harlem Renaissance, which not only exalts the heritage of African American writers and also places unique culture of blacks as means to redefine the long subdued heritage of African Americans. Segregation, discrimination, slavery are writ large in the long history of blacks. Blacks are subjugated to such oppression over generations, while the white man enjoys the so-called the monster statue over the blacks. I quote the poem, The Little Black Boy, from Songs of Innocence of William Blake, were published in the year 1784. My mother bore me in the southern wild. Southern wild indicates about the land and African continent as such. And I am black. But oh, my soul is white. Look here how the poet Blake is introducing the aspect of black and white. And I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English chain. But I am black, has it bereaved of light. Poet Blake places plain over the aspect of black and white complexion, and how white is marked as a cherished complexion of an English child, who is ardently compared to an angel. And in stanza number 3, and we are put on earth a little space. And here, from I, the representation has come into the form of we. And we are put on earth a little space. We indicates the total black community on the globe. Then we learn to hear the beams of love and these black bodies and this sunburnt face. Look how the poets Blake, in a very wonderful way, happened to draw the with his both gravity of this blackness and these black bodies and this sunburnt face is but a cloud and like a shady grove. Thus did my mother say and kissed me, and thus I say to little boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free. Look here, how the parallels he happened to draw here. When I black and he from the white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs with joy. So the poem talks about the equality of blacks and whites in the globe, and it is being composed in the year 1784. And in the subsequent stanzas number 3 and 4 of the poem speak that the white and black complexions are just like clouds, symbolic of temporary state. They are not permanent, only temporary state. Langston Hughes in his poem, I Too, composed in the year 1925. Look here, nearly 150 years after, demonstrates a yearning for equality among the whites and blacks, and this approves the idea that patriotism is not limited to a race. I beg your pardon, here in the country also, only one section of the people here are claiming that they are the real patriots, not the other section. It's very sorrow state to feel about as such. Further, it takes flight of the darker brother of the continent. I would like to stress, this is my finding in my paper. So further, it takes flight of the darker brother of the continent. I too seek America, and the darker brother, they send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen there. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen there. Besides, they will see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am American. So after 150 years of the so-called civilization of modern man, the same, what kind of separation William Blake has got, the same is the last Hughes poem also. Last in his essay entitled The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, published in the Nation 1926, observes, we younger artists now intend to express our individual dark skin selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they're not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. Does this piece of writing of a Lansing instance among black to consider black complexion is as equal to white ones, and blacks need not to be scared of and need not to feel ashamed of black complexion. While Toni Morrison in her Playing with the Dog, Whiteness and Literary Imagination, published in the year 1992, reflects the scholarship that looks into mind, imagination, and behavior of slave is valuable. I do repeat. The scholarship that looks into mind, imagination, and behavior of slave is valuable, but equally valuable is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of monsters. In the context, I draw the scholars over here. The same sort of concept and the notion has been said by our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi, in regard with the Britishers. But equally valuable is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of masses. When Britishers were ruling us, at the same time, they also lost certain what called natural instincts of human beings by being the master and governing the Indians, and they kept us for nearly 150 years under the what called bonds of British. Nabokov clearly speaks about both of black aesthetics and white aesthetics, got associated with the development of literature. Further, Toni Morrison, in her Black Matters, says, quote, a criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal, but also race-free. A criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal, but also race-free. This legitimizing that literature and diminishes both the art and the artist. I will conclude the paper with a poem of Toni Morrison, Identity Poem. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilization. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. We in the poem represent blacks as well as black aesthetics. And the word civilizations do denote both white civilizations and black civilizations, as this paper proposes and insights.
So thank you for your excellent presentation. Now it's open for comments, questions, and questions. We are paper had covered personal and political. Report on the also. Yes. Yeah. White aesthetics as well as black aesthetics are similar. Is it the escape from the reality to romanticize the black
literature or black is beautiful. To say black is beautiful is the romanticization of the slavery, oppression, exploitation by the blacks, or to escape from the reality like romantic poets.
I don't think that way, sir. The thing is that the Western aesthetics and Western civilization has instilled white as the cherished aspect. And the reality is that in the poem I too, because as like a white man, black man also has all the faculties of human potentials. But these potentials have been submerged by the psyche of them have been submerged by the white aesthetics. And it is not an escape, but it is rediscovering their own ground, I believe.
Back to reality.
Yes, reality is the fact.
We have one slavery, racism, simulation. See, okay, for instance, until unless you annihilate the caste system, there will not be any kind of equality. You require any kind of tool to annihilate the racism, to have the equality between whites and blacks, to have the norms.
What I feel, sir, the thing is that in the long evolution of any civilization, either of white or black, in the process of evolution, we happen to foresee and get one point of concept. And when the time passes over, and the human beings will overcome that concept and the idea. For instance, I would like to express this with an example of, say, from science. Newton says that when something falls in the ground, it is gravitation. And all the mankind for nearly 150 years acknowledged and found it is correct and it's all right. Until Albert Einstein came and said that gravitation is just not falling of bodies, it is about space and time convention. Then what I mean to say that it is like the stepping of the truth is from one level to another level. We find so many things. We find in our studies so many things about that. But one after other, in the long march of the mankind,
Don't you think that the recompartmentalization of evolution or transcriptization, don't you think, no, as you refer, you can, it's applicable. But, in terms of the caste and racism, it is the same kind of, I think, how can we contextualize Newton's law here, this kind of racism and evolution?
what I mean to say is that the truth of one period of time cannot be worked in the same after a point of time. That is what I would like to say. Because the other day was trying to look at what called Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Bible of Negroes, from the Dalit perspective. I don't think that it could be viewed, but the thing is that in the Uncle Tom's Cabin, the element of Christianity is there. But when you go to the our what called the Dalit movement, so we have got the annihilation of caste of B.R. Ambedkar. It has called a mythological, ethical background to support that. So whereas Algorithm's carrying, this is what I would like to share the other day, sir, with you. And I'm very much pleased you have seen that Algorithm's carrying of nearly 2 generations. Still, it is alive and it is the portrait of Algorithm as a caricature. I think it's very much. So that's all about, sir. Pardon? Yes, 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 yes. And maybe the other time, my visiting for baby has talked about double subjugation to women. So the thing is that it all depends upon the refinement of the civilization that a society happens to exist. So the sort of discrimination, the sort of vulnerability depends upon what you would like to say that the cultural, what called background of that society. Actually, capitalism has no place for Indian society and Indian mythology.
Thank you all for the session. You are insightful observations of the details of Afro-American. So thank you, Vanana, for your contribution into this session as well as the education conference. Thank you, Vanana.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for this talk.
Just concluding. No, sir, we'll break for lunch, sir, and we'll be back. Yes, sir, okay.
So it's really in popularity, you can understand that Afro-American literature is a revolutionary and insurgency against the mainstream literature. So with this, I wish to thank you, Vanana.
In the castle. Yes, sir. Valedictory. అదే సార్ వాలిటరీలోనే ఒక పార్ట్ సార్ లంచ్కి you know sir where is the lunch? Yes. Oh sir, we are sorry.